Hi, I'm Ashley, and today I am doing a kind of new style of watercolor painting. And this painting was really inspired by two artists that I really admire. I really love their artwork, Leonid Afremov and Daniel Wall. Now, they're both like modern impressionistic painters, so they use really bright, vivid colors, and they paint in oil, but they use a palette knife mostly, and they do thick, like boxy almost impasto style paintings. So they're really thick and textured, and they have like that boxy impressionistic feel. It's almost like pointillism, but on a like grander scale, like larger strokes versus small little dots. So this style really is inspired by like historic impressionism, but due to the vivid colors that it uses, it's really brought more up to date and modern. So obviously I can't build up layers and thickness to create an impasto style in watercolor, but I want to use my brushstrokes to mimic it and give it that same feel and impression. So I use that style here in this painting to create just a beautiful fall scene with a path and a simple little figure, but I'm really going for that impressionistic style. So this painting was done on Baohong 100% cotton paper, Academy actually, so it's their student grade, but it's great paper. And this was on a 10.2 by 15 inch block. And it's really awesome paper, and this was rough textured to really let some of the dry brushing strokes really shine through. And this painting took me about 2 hours to complete, but for the video, I do time-lapse it and speed it up about 8 times to make it more manageable. So let's go ahead and get into the painting.
I start by wetting up the whole page with a really large flat wash brush, and then I add just a very pale blue to give the illusion of kind of a background sky. It doesn't have to be really intense. And then I paint in the water using a mix of cobalt blue and Payne's gray. I did not do a preliminary drawing on this one because I'm really going for a more like spontaneous painting. So for the water, I just use horizontal brush strokes to create that illusion of movement. And then I mix up a kind of a mix of lemon yellow deep and yellow ochre to paint the bank area and the path on the left. I add some earthy greens to the left side to create kind of a hill leading down toward the path. And I use a mix of the watercolor there, the yellow and cobalt to create that kind of grayish earthy green. The page is still really nice and wet, so I start to add in some splotchy yellows and kind of yellow greens to create some trees. I add a little bit of darker color to the bottom of the trees to create like the illusion of shadow, even in these early stages. And right now it's all super wet, and so everything is getting that nice like fuzzy faded out look. And that's really how I want to keep it for the first layers. It's all very loose and fuzzy edged. For the distant trees in the background, I mix up more of even more grayish green. It's a lot cooler and paler to create the illusion of distance. So I still add some darker colors to the bottom of those areas, again, just to create that illusion of shadow, but keeping the background much more like desaturated, so grayer and lighter value creates that sense of distance. I use the back of my paintbrush here to kind of scratch into the paper, and that makes the paint seep into those areas and create some nice branch effect without really any effort. I mixed a deeper blue with more Payne's gray for the water, and I really just kind of streak that in. I do try to make it nice and dark toward the right side, and then I use dry brushing and kind of let it fade out as I come toward the left side of the river. I'm really trying to keep my brush strokes loose and chaotic for the water. I mix up a slightly darker value of the green for the hill and splotch that on. I'm making it a bit warmer green, so I add more yellow to it, and it's a darker value as I come forward, and that again helps with that illusion of distance. I also splatter in some paint here to create a natural texture, and because it's fun, I love splattering. I drop in some more concentrated yellows to create interest, and then I kind of move on to the path. So here I'm really going for almost like square splotchy brush strokes. I'm using a medium flat brush to create these shapes. And as I continue to build it up, I just make the mixtures thicker and warmer. So less water and then shifting toward the warmer colors. And that'll give the illusion of fallen leaves once the trees are in. So again, as I come to the bottom of the page, which is the front closest to us, it's much warmer and it's a darker value. And then as I go back toward the background, it fades out. For the right side, I stroke in some more concentrated yellow just to create a little bit warmth. And then I add a bit more shadow over there. I do return back to the path and splotch in some light greens into the path. I wanted the reds and oranges to dry just a bit before adding those greens so that they didn't blend together and just make a muddy brown. So by giving it that moment, working on the right and letting it dry a little bit, it kept it from mixing too much. I then add in some like neutral green grasses along the bank using just a quick upward brush stroke to paint those in. So I really don't have a lot of water on my brush. So as I'm going, I end up with some dry brush texture, especially on this rough paper, and it really just makes it look very appealing. I do add a little bit of like vivid orange grasses as well, just to give it some contrast with the green, like earthy tones, but everything is still very earthy and muted here. It's not bright like pure colors. Everything's muted down. I touch in some dark brown for some shadows around the grasses as well, and then move back to the distance. So I go back to another like pale green and create a bit more distinctive trees, and then create the trunks using just the very tip of my flat wash brush to paint those nice thin lines. So even with a slightly larger brush, you can paint thin lines as long as you're using a light touch. On the right, I add some really dark, like greenish gray for the tree trunks. And I'm, again, just really trying to stay nice and loose. So for those thin branches, I'm using a liner brush, which creates just really natural, loose brush strokes. And then I start to add more of like my boxy brush strokes in a really yellow-green for the first layer of leaves. So I want to start with my lightest colors and then build up. So I just kind of dab those in. And then I add my first tree trunk on the left. So I paint that in with just a small brush, and then I add a layer of green leaves to this tree. So this tree is the only tree that's more on the left side of the path. The right's lined with trees, but the left, this one is kind of the Lone Ranger over here. Now for the trees lining the river, I paint the trunks to look sort of like birch tree trunks, where they are like that white and gray streaky bark. So I start with just a dark gray line on one side, and then I use horizontal brush strokes to pull some of that pigment out from it. And I add some branches coming off and add just a bit more darkness randomly throughout the trunk. And I basically use that same process for the entire line of trees going into the distance. But for each tree, I make it a slightly lighter value. So again, as you're receding into the picture to create that illusion of depth using atmospheric perspective principles, it's going to be usually a cooler color and a lighter value. There are always exceptions to that, but I really am utilizing that for this painting. So after I get those trees in, I do add some darker grasses around the base of the trees just to make them look a little bit more incorporated into the landscape and not like they're just plopped there on top. Next, I mix up some yellow and I do my first layer of leaves for all of these trees. So I kind of twist the brush in my fingers to create a variety of shapes, but because I'm using that flat wash brush and using it basically kind of on its side, they are all staying really like geometric and boxy. And that's really my goal for this, is to keep my brush strokes really geometric and boxy and loose and not try to paint like my vision for what a leaf looks like. I do add some darker colors as I go with oranges, reds, browns, and some greens. And I also splatter some to create even more texture. I splatter on the ground as well to give more texture to the closest part of the path. And I pretty much incorporate splatters into every painting that I do just because I love it. I think it's fun and it helps me loosen up and let go of some of the control too. On the right side, I add another layer of greener leaves and some darker shadows under those trees as well. And I just put a touch of water to add some green reflections and then some more grasses kind of around the bank as well. For the background, I wanted the tree line to kind of continue along the water. So I add some very light value tree trunks with just some very warm, like splotchy leaves, but very light value, just to create that illusion that the path is continuing along. And again, more splatters always. And I add just a little bit more orange to the very far left tree. I felt like it was just a little bit too green and drawing a little bit too much attention. So I dropped in some orange into it to make it blend just a little bit better. Finally, I add the girl walking her dog on the path. I did practice a few shapes on the scratch paper, which you can see in the corner. And then I just copied my favorite one, basically. So I just started at the waist, painted in the legs, and it's super simple brush strokes. And then used a bright red for her trunk and for her arms. A tiny bit of dark brown for her hair for like a swinging ponytail and the leash. And then a dog with super simple shapes. Pretty much just like a rectangle with a little sweep for a tail. So very simple figure painting here, but it's effective in this landscape. I finish off with just some shadows for the figures and for the tree trunks. So keeping all the shadows going from the base of the object toward the left. And then I just add one more layer of my very brightest colors for the front tree. So I want that tree to really kind of pop more toward the foreground. So I just add one more layer of really dark value and vivid colors there. I do also include some opaque yellow to make sure that I keep some of the lights and then it just doesn't get like overpoweringly red. So yellow in watercolor, not always, there are transparent yellows, but they tend to be a little bit more opaque. So they can actually kind of layer over some of your darker colors a little bit. And there it is, just sign it and it's done. And I love this style so much. I know I'll definitely do more paintings using these same techniques. Thank you so much for watching. I really, really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Have an awesome day.